My name is Lydia Harper, and for 3 years, my parents thought I was barely scraping by in a cramped apartment in Capitol Hill, working double shifts at a bookstore cafe just to make rent. They'd sigh dramatically whenever my name came up at family dinners. "Poor Lydia," they'd say, shaking their heads with that perfect blend of pity and disappointment. If only she'd applied herself like Natalie. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What they didn't know was that every month, without lifting a finger, $400,000 flowed into an account they had no idea existed. My grandmother made sure of that before she passed. She knew exactly what kind of people her son and daughter-in-law had become, and she made certain I'd never need their approval or their money. But I let them believe I was failing, struggling, drowning in bills I couldn't pay. And in doing so, I learned exactly who they really were. The rain came down in sheets that November afternoon, turning the streets of Capitol Hill into rivers of reflected neon and blurred headlights. I stood behind the counter at the Copper Bean, wiping down the espresso machine for what felt like the 100th time that day. My apron was stained with coffee grounds and steamed milk, my hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that had given up any pretense of style hours ago. A customer walked in, shaking water from her umbrella, and I smiled the way I'd been trained to smile. Warm, approachable, just tired enough to seem authentic. This was my life, or at least, this was what my life looked like to anyone watching. I worked 4 shifts a week at the Copper Bean, took the bus everywhere, shopped at thrift stores, and lived in a 5th-floor walk-up with a radiator that clanked like a prisoner trying to escape. My parents had visited once, 2 years ago, and my mother had actually gasped when she saw the place. The kitchen was the size of a closet. The bathroom tiles were chipped. There was a water stain on the ceiling shaped like a map of Idaho. Lydia Harper, my mother, had stood in the center of that tiny living room with her Burberry coat still buttoned, looking around as if she'd just stepped into a crime scene. "Lydia," she'd said slowly, as if testing whether I was lucid, "you can't possibly be comfortable here." My father, Gregory, had peered into the bedroom, which was barely large enough for a twin bed and a dresser, and frowned. "This is what you chose over business school?" I'd shrugged, stirring a pot of ramen on the ancient electric stove. "It's what I can afford," I'd said simply. They'd exchanged a look, the kind of look parents give each other when their child has confirmed their worst fears. Then my mother had straightened her shoulders and said, "Well, if you'd taken the opportunities we gave you, you wouldn't be living like this. But you made your choice." They left 20 minutes later. My mother didn't even sit down. When the door closed behind them, I'd stood in the middle of that cramped apartment and smiled. Not because I enjoyed deceiving them, but because I'd just confirmed something I'd suspected for years. They didn't love me. They loved the idea of a daughter who reflected well on them. And when I stopped being that reflection, I stopped mattering. What they didn't know, what nobody knew except my financial advisor and my grandmother's estate lawyer, was that 3 blocks away, in a secure building with a doorman and a view of Elliott Bay, I owned a penthouse. Not rented. Owned. Paid in full. The place was modern, elegant, filled with art I'd collected and furniture I'd chosen myself. That was where I actually lived. The Capitol Hill apartment was just a set piece, a carefully constructed illusion. My grandmother, Dorothy Fontaine, had been a quiet woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. She'd made her fortune in tech stocks back in the 80s, long before anyone took women investors seriously. By the time she passed away when I was 22, she'd accumulated a portfolio worth north of $60 million. She'd watched my parents carefully over the years, watched how they treated me versus how they treated Natalie, my older sister. She noticed things others missed. The way my mother's voice warmed when Natalie entered a room. The way my father's eyes glazed over when I spoke about my interests. The way I was always introduced second, always mentioned as an afterthought. 6 months before she died, my grandmother called me to her estate on San Juan Island. We sat on the porch overlooking the water, drinking tea while the sun set in shades of orange and pink. "Lydia," she'd said, her voice still strong despite the cancer eating away at her lungs, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully." I'd nodded, setting down my cup. Your parents are going to leave everything to Natalie. I already know this because your father asked me for advice on the will. I hadn't been surprised. Hurt, maybe, but not surprised. Grandmother had reached over and taken my hand. So I'm evening the scales. I'm setting up a trust for you, but it's going to be structured in a way they can never touch, never contest, and never even know about unless you choose to tell them. The paperwork is airtight. I've had 3 different law firms review it. When I'm gone, you'll have more money than you'll ever need, but Lydia, I want you to promise me something. I'd looked at her, this woman who'd always seen me clearly when my own parents looked right through me. Don't let it change you, she'd said. And don't let them know until you're ready. Because once they find out, they'll try to rewrite history. They'll pretend they always valued you. They'll want back in. So take your time. Figure out who you are without their judgment hanging over you. And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, you can show them exactly what they overlooked. The trust activated on my 23rd birthday. I was living in a genuine studio apartment at the time, working at a coffee shop because I genuinely enjoyed it, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Then Diane Westbrook, the trust manager, called me into her office downtown. She'd explained the structure, the monthly distributions, the growth projections. I'd sat there in a folding chair, wearing jeans with a hole in the knee, and tried to comprehend what she was telling me. $400,000, she'd repeated, seeing my blank expression. Every month. Adjusted for inflation annually. The principal remains untouched and continues to grow. Your grandmother was very, very good at what she did, Miss Harper. I'd walked out of that office in a daze. For 2 weeks, I didn't touch the money. I kept going to work, kept paying rent on my studio, kept taking the bus. I was terrified that if I acknowledged it, it would somehow disappear, or worse, that it would turn me into the kind of person my parents had always wanted me to be. But then something shifted. I realized my grandmother had given me something far more valuable than money. She'd given me freedom. The freedom to disappoint my parents without consequence. The freedom to be exactly who I was without needing their approval or their financial support. And more than that, she'd given me the opportunity to see them clearly, without the fog of dependency or hope clouding my vision. So I made a choice. I bought the penthouse and furnished it exactly how I wanted. I kept working at the Copper Bean because I liked the rhythm of it, the small interactions, the simplicity. I kept the Capitol Hill apartment as a decoy and made sure my parents had that address, that phone number, that version of my life. And I watched. I watched how they spoke about me to relatives. I watched how they introduced Natalie versus how they mentioned me, if they mentioned me at all. I watched how they responded when I called, when I didn't call, when I showed up to family events in thrift store clothes versus when Natalie arrived in designer everything. Natalie, to her credit, wasn't cruel. She was just indifferent, which somehow felt worse. She worked at Harper and Associates Consulting, the family firm my father had built, and she was good at it. Brilliant, even. She closed deals, brought in clients, and made my parents proud in all the ways I apparently never could. At family dinners, she'd talk about her latest project, some corporate merger or international expansion, and my parents would lean forward, engaged, asking questions, offering advice. When it was my turn to speak, if anyone bothered to ask, I'd mention something about work or a book I'd read. My mother would nod politely, her attention already drifting toward her phone. My father would make a noncommittal sound and change the subject. It was like being a ghost at your own family gathering, present but not seen, heard but not listened to. The breaking point came on a Wednesday evening in late October. My parents were hosting a dinner party at their Mercer Island estate, one of those carefully curated events where every guest served a purpose, every conversation was strategic. I'd been invited, probably because it would look strange if their younger daughter wasn't there, but the invitation had come via text from my mother's assistant. Not even from her directly. I showed up in a sweater I'd bought at a vintage shop and pants I'd owned since college. My mother's eyes had swept over me when I walked in, and I saw the familiar tightness around her mouth. "Lydia," she'd said, her voice measured, "we have guests." "I know," I'd replied. That's why I'm here. She'd wanted to say more, I could tell, but people were already arriving, and she couldn't risk a scene. The evening unfolded exactly as I'd expected. I was seated at the far end of the table, between a corporate lawyer who spent the entire meal on his phone and an older woman who kept calling me Natalie. Across from me, my sister held court, discussing some deal she'd just closed with a tech startup in Vancouver. My father beamed. My mother interjected with pride-laced observations about Natalie's work ethic, her vision, her future. I ate quietly, observing the performance. At one point, someone asked me what I did, and before I could answer, my mother jumped in. Lydia works in hospitality, she said, which was technically true but delivered in a tone that made it sound like a euphemism for unemployment. She's still finding her path. The table had nodded sympathetically and moved on. Later, after dessert, I'd gone to the bathroom and passed by my father's study. The door was slightly open, and I heard voices inside. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My mother and father, speaking in low tones. I shouldn't have stopped. I should have kept walking. But something made me pause just outside the door, hidden by the angle of the hallway. I just don't understand where we went wrong with her, my mother was saying. We gave her every opportunity. The same schools, the same connections. But she's nearly 30 and working at a coffee shop, Gregory. A coffee shop. My father sighed. She's always been stubborn. Refused business school, refused to join the firm. What else could we do? We can't force her to succeed. There was a pause, then my mother's voice again, sharper now. Natalie suggested we stop including her in family events. She thinks it's embarrassing, having to explain why her sister is so, she paused, searching for the word, directionless. I almost laughed. Almost. My father murmured something I couldn't hear, and my mother continued. Maybe she's right. Maybe we've been enabling Lydia by pretending everything is fine. Perhaps some distance would motivate her to finally take life seriously. I stepped back from the door, my heart pounding not with sadness but with a strange, cold clarity. This wasn't new information. I'd suspected it for years. But hearing it spoken aloud, in their own words, was different. It wasn't interpretation or paranoia. It was confirmation. I didn't confront them. I didn't storm into the study or make a scene. I simply collected my coat, said polite goodbyes to the guests I passed on my way out, and left. My mother called after me, something about staying for coffee, but I was already out the door. I walked down the long driveway, past the perfectly manicured hedges and the fountain that cost more than most people's cars, and called a car to take me home. Not to Capitol Hill. Home. The penthouse was quiet when I arrived, the floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the city lights reflected in the dark water of the bay. I stood there for a long time, still wearing my thrift store sweater, and felt something inside me finally settle. I'd spent 3 years waiting to feel guilty about the deception, about letting them believe I was struggling. But standing there that night, I felt nothing but relief. Relief that I didn't need them. Relief that their judgment couldn't touch me. And relief that I'd been right about who they were all along. The next morning, I called Diane Westbrook. We need to talk, I said. I think it's time to make some changes. She met me at a downtown cafe, her leather portfolio already filled with documents. Lydia, she said, settling into the chair across from me, I've been wondering when you'd call. I smiled. I want to start being more visible with the money. Not to my family, not yet. But I want to do something with it. Something real. She nodded slowly. What did you have in mind? I'd been thinking about it all night. My grandmother had built her fortune carefully, intelligently, and she'd given it to me with only one instruction. Don't let it change who you are. But I realized that didn't mean hiding. It meant using it in a way that reflected my values, not theirs. I want to start a financial literacy program, I said. For young people who don't have access to the kind of education and resources my family took for granted. Kids who are told they're not smart enough, not focused enough, not enough period. Diane smiled, a real smile. Your grandmother would have loved that. Over the next few weeks, we laid the groundwork. I established the Lighthouse Initiative, a nonprofit focused on teaching financial literacy, investment basics, and economic empowerment to teenagers in underserved communities around Tacoma and South Seattle. I didn't put my name on it, not prominently. I worked quietly, hiring a small team, developing curriculum, partnering with local schools. My parents had no idea. I still showed up to occasional family dinners in my worn-out clothes, still mentioned my shifts at the Copper Bean, still played the part of the disappointing daughter. But now, it wasn't about hiding. It was about control. I was choosing what they got to see, and more importantly, I was building something they couldn't take credit for, couldn't attach themselves to, couldn't use to rehabilitate their image as loving, supportive parents. Natalie called me one evening in early December. It was rare for her to reach out directly. Hey, she said, her voice carefully casual. Mom's planning a holiday party. She wanted me to check if you're coming. I stirred the pasta I was cooking in my penthouse kitchen, the city glittering behind me. Yeah, I'll be there. There was a pause. She also wanted me to mention, Natalie continued, and I could hear the discomfort in her voice, that if you need help, financially or otherwise, you should just ask. We're family. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone a little tighter. Tell her I'm fine. I'm actually doing really well. Another pause. Okay, Natalie said slowly. I'll let her know. After we hung up, I stood there thinking about that word. Family. What did it mean when the people who were supposed to know you best didn't know you at all? When they looked at you and saw only their own disappointment reflected back? The holiday party arrived 2 weeks later, and I showed up exactly as expected. Thrift store dress, minimal makeup, the same old coat I'd been wearing for years. The house was decorated like something from a magazine spread, white lights and silver ornaments, a tree that touched the vaulted ceiling. Guests milled around with champagne flutes, talking about year-end bonuses and vacation homes and their children's accomplishments. I found myself standing near the fireplace, holding a glass of wine I hadn't touched, when I overheard my mother talking to Mrs. Delacroix, one of her oldest friends. She was speaking just loudly enough to be heard over the ambient noise. We're so proud of Natalie, she was saying. She's being considered for junior partner at the firm. Only 32 and already making such an impact. Mrs. Delacroix murmured something congratulatory, then asked, and Lydia? How is she doing? My mother's smile tightened just slightly. Lydia is, she paused, finding herself. We're hopeful she'll eventually settle into something stable. It was the way she said it. Finding herself. Like I was a teenager backpacking through Europe, not a grown woman with a life they knew nothing about. Like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. I set down my wine glass and walked over. Hi Mrs. Delacroix, I said warmly. It's good to see you. She smiled, genuine affection in her eyes. She'd always been kind to me. Lydia, darling. Your mother was just telling me about Natalie's success. You must be so proud of your sister. I am, I said honestly. She's very good at what she does. And what about you? Mrs. Delacroix asked. What are you up to these days? My mother opened her mouth, ready to interject with her usual dismissive summary, but I spoke first. I've been working on a project, I said. A nonprofit focused on financial education for young people. We just finished our first full semester of programming. Mrs. Delacroix's eyes lit up. Oh, how wonderful. That sounds incredibly meaningful. My mother blinked, clearly surprised. You never mentioned that, she said carefully. I met her eyes. You never asked. The moment hung in the air, fragile and sharp. Then Mrs. Delacroix, oblivious to the tension, started asking questions about the Lighthouse Initiative. I answered them thoughtfully, watching my mother's expression shift from confusion to something harder to read. When Mrs. Delacroix finally excused herself to find her husband, my mother turned to me fully. "A non-profit," she said. "How are you funding that on a barista's salary?" "Grants," I said simply. "Donations." My grandmother taught me a lot about managing resources. It wasn't a lie, just an incomplete truth. My mother studied me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to reconcile this version of me with the one she'd constructed in her mind. The struggling, directionless daughter who couldn't get her life together. Before she could ask anything else, my father called her over to greet some arriving guests. She touched my arm briefly, a gesture that might have looked affectionate to anyone watching, and said quietly, "We should talk more about this later." Then she was gone, swept back into hostess mode. I stayed at the party for another hour, then slipped out the same way I always did. Quietly, without fanfare. But this time, as I walked to the car waiting for me at the end of the driveway, I felt something shift. The performance was getting harder to maintain, not because I was tired of it, but because I was starting to realize that keeping them in the dark wasn't protecting me anymore. It was protecting them. Protecting them from having to confront what they'd done, who they'd been, how easily they'd written me off. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do that anymore. My grandmother had told me to wait until I was ready. I think I was finally getting close. The winter rain turned to sleet by mid-January, coating Seattle in a layer of ice that made the city slow down and hold its breath. I sat in Diane Westbrook's office on the 42nd floor of the Columbia Center, watching the frozen streets below while she reviewed the latest trust statements. The numbers had grown again, compounding interest and strategic investments pushing the monthly distribution even higher. I barely glanced at the figures anymore. They'd stopped feeling real somewhere around month 6. What caught my attention instead was the folder Diane slid across her desk toward me. Inside were photographs, old ones, some I'd never seen before. My grandmother at various ages, standing in front of buildings, shaking hands with men in suits, holding awards. There was one of her in her 30s, standing outside what looked like a warehouse, a small sign visible in the corner that read Fontaine Technologies. "I found these in the archived files from your grandmother's estate," Diane said. "She wanted you to have them when the time was right. I think she knew you'd eventually want to understand her full story, not just the version your family told." I picked up the photograph of the warehouse, studying my grandmother's face. She looked determined, almost fierce. What version did my family tell? Diane leaned back in her chair, choosing her words carefully. They spoke about her as if she'd been lucky. As if she'd simply invested well by accident, married the right man, ended up wealthy through circumstance. But Dorothy Fontaine built her own company from nothing, sold it for $30 million in 1991, then turned that into 60 through careful, brilliant investment strategy. She didn't need anyone's help, and she didn't ask for permission. I traced my finger along the edge of the photo. My father never mentioned she had a company. Because admitting that would mean admitting his mother was more successful than he ever was, Diane said quietly. And that she did it without his help or approval. The Harpers prefer a narrative where wealth comes from legacy and lineage, not from a woman who taught herself coding in her garage. Something cold settled in my chest. They erased her too. Diane nodded. Softened her, made her palatable. She noticed, Lydia. That's why she structured the trust the way she did. She knew they'd do the same to you if you let them. I closed the folder, but kept my hand on it. Tell me something. Do you think she'd want me to keep hiding? Diane was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the frozen city. I think she wanted you to choose your own time. But I also think she'd want you to know that hiding doesn't always mean safety. Sometimes it just means delay. I left her office with the folder tucked under my arm and my grandmother's words echoing in my head. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, you can show them exactly what they overlooked. The call came 3 days later while I was at the Copper Bean, wiping down tables during the afternoon lull. It was my cousin Iris, my mother's niece, someone I'd barely spoken to in years. She lived in Portland now, worked in sustainable architecture, and had always been the black sheep on that side of the family. Her voice was tense when I answered. Lydia, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not react right away. Just listen. I set down my cleaning cloth and moved to the back room, away from customers. Okay, I'm listening. There's a family meeting happening next month, she said. Your parents are calling it a legacy planning session. They're bringing in lawyers, financial advisors, the works. They're restructuring the Harper estate and the business succession plan. I felt my pulse quicken but kept my voice steady. And they're writing you out completely, Iris said bluntly. I overheard my mom talking to your mother last week. They're formalizing everything so that Natalie inherits the business, the properties, the investment accounts. You're being designated as having received adequate support during your formative years and therefore requiring no further inheritance consideration. That's the actual legal language they're using. I closed my eyes, leaning against the storage shelves. Of course they are. Lydia, I'm sorry, Iris continued. I know we haven't been close, but this feels wrong. You're their daughter. I know you and your parents have had issues, but this is, she trailed off. Calculated, I finished for her. This is calculated. There was a pause on the other end. Yeah. After we hung up, I stood in that back room surrounded by boxes of coffee beans and stacks of paper cups, and I started laughing. Not hysterically, just a low, steady laugh that came from somewhere deep. They were so busy planning how to officially erase me that they had no idea I'd never needed their money in the first place. They were dividing an estate I'd already surpassed. They were protecting assets I could buy outright without blinking. That night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I went back to the Capitol Hill apartment, the decoy, and I sat on the worn couch in the dim light. I tried to imagine what they thought when they pictured my life. Did they think I cried myself to sleep over their rejection? Did they imagine me struggling to pay bills, eating ramen, wishing desperately that they'd welcome me back into the fold? The cruelty wasn't in the disinheritance itself. It was in the assumption that I needed them, that I was sitting somewhere waiting desperately for their validation, their acceptance, their money. They'd built an entire narrative around my failure, and they'd never once checked to see if it was true. I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app one rarely looked at. The trust account balance stared back at me, a number so large it still didn't feel real. Then I opened another app, the one tracking the Lighthouse Initiative's growth. We'd served 200 students in our first semester. We'd received grant applications from 3 other cities wanting to replicate the program. I'd built something real, something that mattered, and I'd done it without their name, their connections, or their approval. My grandmother had been right. The freedom wasn't in the money itself. It was in not needing theirs. But Iris's call had shifted something. They weren't just passively excluding me anymore. They were actively erasing me from the official record, codifying my worthlessness in legal documents. And suddenly, staying hidden didn't feel like power anymore. It felt like letting them win. I called Brennan Cole the next morning. He was the financial advisor I'd started working with 6 months earlier, someone Diane had recommended when I'd mentioned wanting to expand the Lighthouse Initiative. He was in his 50s, spoke in measured tones, and had a reputation for discretion. When I explained what I wanted to do, he was quiet for a long time. "You're sure about this timing," he finally said. "Once you start making moves this visible, there's no going back to anonymity." "I know," I said. "But I'm tired of being invisible to people who should see me." "Fair enough," he replied. "Let's map this out carefully." Over the next 2 weeks, Brennan and I constructed a strategy. Not revenge, not exposure, just visibility. Strategic, intentional visibility that would make it impossible for my family to maintain their narrative about my life. First, we formalized the Lighthouse Initiative's funding structure, creating an endowment that would sustain the program indefinitely. The announcement would go through proper channels, foundations and education networks, nothing flashy, but public enough that anyone searching would find it. Second, we identified 3 other organizations doing similar work in financial literacy and economic empowerment. I would be making substantial donations to each, large enough to warrant press releases and donor recognition. Third, and this was the one that made my heart race, we prepared paperwork to purchase a commercial property in Tacoma that would serve as a permanent home for the Lighthouse Initiative. It would have classrooms, a computer lab, office space, and my name would be on the deed. Public record, easily searchable. Brennan walked me through each step, making sure I understood the implications. Your parents will find out, he said. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. Someone will mention it, or they'll see your name in a foundation newsletter, or a friend will congratulate them on their daughter's philanthropy work. Good, I said. Let them find out. The purchase of the Tacoma property went through on a gray Tuesday in February. The building was a renovated brick structure near the waterfront, 3 stories with huge windows and good bones. I walked through it with the architect and the program director, making notes about classroom layouts and technology needs. Standing in what would become the main learning space, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pride that had nothing to do with my family's approval. The announcement went out the following week through the usual nonprofit channels. Local news picked it up because economic education programs were having a moment in policy discussions. The headline read New Initiative Aims to Close Wealth Gap Through Youth Education, and buried in the 3rd paragraph was my name. Founder Lydia Harper envisions a space where young people can learn financial skills often gate-kept by economic privilege. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't send them a link or mention it at the next family dinner. I simply waited. The call came on a Thursday evening. I was at home, the real home, cooking dinner and listening to music when my phone buzzed. Victoria Harper. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Lydia, my mother said, her voice strange, tight. We need to talk. About what? I asked, stirring pasta sauce. I saw something today, she continued. An article. About some education program in Tacoma. They used your name. I know, I said calmly. It's my program. Silence stretched between us, long and loaded. Your program, she repeated slowly. As in, you founded it? Yes. I founded it, I fund it, and I just purchased a building for it. How, she said, and I could hear her struggling to keep her voice level. How could you possibly afford any of that on what you make? I turned off the stove and leaned against the counter. I don't just work at the Copper Bean, Mom. I never did. That was just something I liked doing. More silence. Then, her voice sharper now, what are you talking about? Grandmother Dorothy left me a trust, I said. A substantial one. It's been funding my life quite comfortably for 3 years now. I heard her intake of breath. That's impossible. She left everything to the family. She left everything to Natalie and your father. Actually, she left most of it to me. The family just didn't know because she made sure the trust was private and ironclad. I could practically hear the wheels turning in her head, recalculating, reassessing. How much, she demanded. Enough, I said simply. Enough that I've never struggled the way you thought I was struggling. Enough that I bought my own place years ago. Enough that I'm funding education programs and making donations that would probably surprise you. Why didn't you tell us? Because you never asked, I said. You looked at my life, decided I was failing, and never once checked to see if you were right. I paused, searching for the right words. You just needed me to be struggling so you could feel better about choosing Natalie. That's not fair, Lydia. Isn't it? I asked. When's the last time you asked me how I actually was instead of just assuming? When's the last time you asked about my life without already having decided what the answer would be? She didn't respond. In the background, I could hear my father's voice asking who she was talking to. I have to go, she said abruptly. We'll discuss this later. She hung up before I could respond. I set down my phone and went back to making dinner, but my hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear or regret, but from adrenaline. I'd finally said it out loud. I'd finally stopped pretending their version of my life was real. The next call came from Natalie, less than an hour later. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Mom just told me, she said. About the trust. Is it true? Yes. How much are we talking about? She asked, and I could hear the edge in her voice. More than you're imagining, I said. Natalie was quiet, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted. You let us think you had nothing. You let Mom and Dad treat you like you were. She stopped herself. Like you were what? I asked. A disappointment? A failure? An embarrassment? I didn't let them do anything, I continued. They did that on their own. I just didn't correct them. Why? She asked, and she sounded genuinely confused. Why would you hide this? Because I wanted to see who you all were when you thought I had nothing to offer, I said. And now I know. Natalie didn't call back that night. The family dinner 3 days later was inevitable. My mother left a voicemail, formal and cold. We need to have a family conversation. Sunday at 6. Your father and I expect you there. I almost didn't go. I could have simply stopped engaging, cut them off cleanly, moved on with my life. But something in me needed to see this through, needed to watch them try to explain themselves now that the ground had shifted beneath their feet. I drove to Mercer Island in my actual car, not the old sedan I usually borrowed from a friend for these occasions, but the Tesla I'd bought last year. I parked in their circular driveway next to Natalie's Audi and my father's Mercedes. When I walked up to the door, I was wearing clothes I'd actually chosen, a simple but well-made dress, good shoes, a coat that fit properly. My mother opened the door, and I watched her eyes sweep over me, cataloging every detail that didn't match her mental image. Lydia, she said carefully. Come in. The living room felt different somehow, or maybe I just felt different in it. My father sat in his usual chair, reading glasses perched on his nose. Natalie was on the couch, her phone face down beside her for once. I took the chair opposite my father and waited. Victoria sat down next to her husband, her posture rigid. So, my father began, looking at me over his glasses. Your mother tells me you've been, he paused, less than forthcoming about your financial situation. That's one way to put it, I said. Why? My mother asked, and there was an anger in her voice I rarely heard. Why would you deceive us like this? I didn't deceive anyone, I replied. I just didn't volunteer information you never asked for. We're your parents, she said. You should have told us. Why? I asked. So you could feel better about the years you spent pitying me? So you could rewrite history and pretend you always believed in me? I looked at my father. You told people I was directionless. I looked at my mother. You told your friends I was still finding myself at 30, like it was a character flaw. That's not fair, my father said. We were concerned. No, I said, my voice steady. You were embarrassed. There's a difference. Natalie spoke for the first time. Lydia, I get that you're angry, but you have to understand how this looks from our perspective. You lied. I didn't lie, I corrected. I let you believe what you wanted to believe. And what you wanted to believe was that I was failing, because it made Natalie's success look even better by comparison. That's not true, Natalie said, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? I asked. Be honest, Nat. How often did you use me as the cautionary tale? How many times did you tell colleagues or clients about your sister who couldn't get it together, just to highlight how focused and driven you were? She looked away. I thought so. My mother's voice cut through. Regardless of our mistakes, you're still our daughter. We deserve to know the truth about your life. Do you? I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, I don't owe you anything. Grandmother Dorothy gave me this trust specifically because she knew you'd never value me the way I deserved. She saw exactly what kind of parents you were. That's a horrible thing to say, my mother said, her voice breaking slightly. It's a true thing to say, I replied. She told me you'd write me out of the will. She knew years before she died that you'd choose Natalie over me, so she made sure I'd be taken care of without needing you." My father set down his glasses. "Your grandmother had no right to create division in this family." "She didn't create it," I said. "She just responded to what already existed." The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, my father spoke, his voice measured. "What do you want from us, Lydia? An apology? Money? A place in the company?" "I want nothing from you," I said, and I meant it. "I wanted you to see me, to value me, to love me as much as you love Natalie. But I don't want that anymore. I've built a life without your approval, and honestly, it's better this way." Natalie looked at me with something like hurt in her eyes. "So what, you're just cutting us off?" "I'm not cutting you off," I said. "I'm just being honest. You're my family by blood, but you've never treated me like family in any way that matters. So from now on, I'll show up when I want to, not because I'm hoping you'll finally see my worth." My mother stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. You're acting like a child." I stood too. "I'm acting like someone who finally realized she doesn't need your permission to exist." I headed for the door, and this time, when my mother called after me, I didn't turn around. I walked out of that house, got into my car, and drove back to the city. My hands were steady on the wheel. My chest felt light. For the first time in my entire life, I'd told my family exactly what I thought of them, and the sky hadn't fallen. The world hadn't ended. I was still here, still whole, still standing. And I'd done it without needing a single thing from them. The bridge wasn't burned. It was just finally visible for what it had always been. A structure I'd been maintaining alone, walking across while they watched from solid ground, never once offering to meet me halfway. I didn't need the bridge anymore. I had my own solid ground now. The days after that dinner blurred together in a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. I kept expecting to feel guilty, to wake up with regret gnawing at my chest, but it never came. Instead, I felt lighter, like I'd been carrying a weight I hadn't fully acknowledged until I finally set it down. Work at the Copper Bean continued as usual. My co-workers had no idea anything had changed, and I liked it that way. There was something grounding about steaming milk and wiping counters, something real that had nothing to do with money or family drama. But the world outside that little coffee shop was shifting. The article about the Lighthouse Initiative had been picked up by a larger education policy blog, and then by a nonprofit newsletter that circulated among philanthropic circles in the Pacific Northwest. My name appeared more frequently now, attached to quotes about economic mobility and educational access. People started recognizing the Harper name, but not because of my father's consulting firm. Because of me. Iris called me on a rainy Saturday morning while I was reviewing curriculum proposals at my penthouse. I could hear the smile in her voice before she even spoke. "So I'm assuming you've seen the foundation newsletter that went out yesterday?" I hadn't, actually. I'd been deliberately avoiding most of my email, still processing everything. "What newsletter?" "The Cascade Foundation," she said. "They featured the Lighthouse Initiative as one of their spotlight programs this quarter. There's a whole profile about you, about your approach to economic education, about how you're self-funding the operation. My mom called me at 7 this morning asking if I knew you were apparently some kind of secret philanthropist." I laughed despite myself. "What did you tell her?" "That I was as surprised as everyone else," Iris said. "Which is mostly true. I knew you were doing something with a nonprofit, but I didn't realize the scale." She paused. "Lydia, they're calling you an emerging leader in economic justice work. That's not a small thing." It felt surreal, hearing someone describe my work that way. For so long, my identity had been shaped by what I wasn't. Not ambitious enough. Not focused enough. Not successful like Natalie. Now people were defining me by what I was actually doing, and they didn't seem disappointed at all. "How's your mom handling all this?" Iris asked carefully. "I haven't talked to her since last Sunday." There was a beat of silence. She's been calling my mom. A lot. Apparently, she's trying to figure out how much money we're actually talking about. She's going through everyone who might know, asking about grandmother Dorothy's estate, trying to piece together what happened. I wasn't surprised. Of course she was. What are people telling her? Not much, Iris said. Most people didn't know about the trust because your grandmother was careful. But the ones who did know, like Diane Westbrook and some of the old estate lawyers, they're not saying anything. Attorney-client privilege and all that. It's driving your mom crazy because she can't control the narrative. Good, I said, and I meant it. Let her sit with not knowing. Let her feel what it's like to be on the outside. Iris laughed softly. You've changed. You sound different. I feel different, I admitted. For years, I kept waiting for them to see me, really see me. I thought if I just kept showing up, kept trying, eventually they'd realize I was worth their attention. But I was looking for something they were never going to give. So now I'm done looking. We talked for a few more minutes before hanging up, and I sat there staring out at the gray sky, thinking about what she'd said. You've changed. Had I? Or had I just finally become visible to myself? The following week brought an unexpected email. It was from someone named Kevin Tran, a journalist who wrote for a Seattle-based business magazine. The subject line read Feature Interview Request for Emerging Philanthropist Series. I almost deleted it, assuming it was some generic pitch, but something made me open it. His message was thoughtful, specific. He'd read about the Lighthouse Initiative and wanted to do a deeper story about young philanthropists who were taking unconventional approaches to wealth and giving. I sat with the email for 2 days before responding. A profile would mean more visibility, more questions, more chances for my family to feel ambushed by information they thought they should have controlled. But it would also mean telling my story on my terms, not waiting for someone else to construct a narrative around the gaps and rumors. I wrote back and agreed to meet him for coffee. Not at the Copper Bean, somewhere neutral. We met at a place in Fremont, tucked away from downtown foot traffic. Kevin was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with an easy manner that immediately put me at ease. He ordered tea and pulled out a notebook, old school, no recorder. Some people find those intimidating, he explained. I find better conversations happen when people forget they're being interviewed. Smart, I said. He started with the expected questions. Background on the Lighthouse Initiative, my philosophy on economic education, what inspired the work. I answered honestly, talking about how financial literacy was often treated as something you either inherently understood or didn't, when really it was just information that certain communities had access to and others didn't. We talked about curriculum design and the importance of teaching not just budgeting but wealth building, investment, how money could be a tool rather than a source of shame or mystery. Then he shifted. I hope this isn't too personal, but I'm curious about your own background. You come from the Harper family, right? Harper and Associates? I nodded slowly. That's my father's firm. But this work, Kevin continued, reading from his notes, you're self-funding it. That's what the Cascade Foundation profile suggested. Most people starting nonprofits are hustling for grants and donor meetings. You're writing checks from your own accounts. How does someone in their early 30s have that kind of capital? There it was. The question I'd known was coming. I could deflect, keep it vague, maintain some level of privacy. Or I could tell the truth and let the record show exactly where my resources came from. I took a breath. My grandmother, Dorothy Fontaine, established a trust for me before she passed. She was a tech investor and entrepreneur back when women weren't really welcomed in those spaces. She built significant wealth on her own terms and wanted to make sure I had the same freedom she'd fought for. Kevin wrote quickly, nodding. So this isn't family money in the traditional sense. It's legacy from your grandmother specifically. Exactly, I said. And she structured it in a way that kept it separate from the rest of the family estate because she understood something important. She understood that the people who are supposed to support you don't always see your value, especially if you don't fit their definition of success. He looked up from his notebook, meeting my eyes. That sounds personal. It is, I said. My family didn't know about the trust until recently. They thought I was struggling financially, working retail, barely getting by. And I let them think that because I wanted to see who they were when they thought I had nothing. His pen paused mid-word. And who were they? I chose my words carefully. They were people who measured worth by accomplishment and status. When they thought I didn't have those things, I became invisible to them. So when I finally had resources to do meaningful work, I did it without their name attached, without their approval, without needing them to validate it. Kevin sat back, studying me. That's a hell of a story. It's my story, I said. And I'm tired of it being told by people who don't actually know me. The interview lasted another hour. We talked about the future of the Lighthouse Initiative, about expansion plans and the partnership inquiries I'd been receiving from other cities. He asked about my relationship with my family now, and I was honest. Complicated. Distant. Still figuring out what it means to have boundaries with people who never respected them before. When we finished, Kevin closed his notebook and looked at me thoughtfully. Can I ask you something off the record? I nodded. Do you think you'll ever reconcile with them? Fully, I mean. I considered the question. I don't know. Right now, I'm not trying to reconcile. I'm just trying to build a life that's mine, that reflects my values, that doesn't require their permission or approval. Maybe that's enough. He smiled. I think a lot of people are going to relate to this. The article ran 3 weeks later. It was the cover story, which I hadn't expected. The headline read, "When Family Legacy Isn't Enough, Building Your Own." My photo took up half the page, taken at the Lighthouse Initiative building in Tacoma. I looked confident in it, standing in front of windows with students visible in the background. I barely recognized myself. The story was fair, thorough, and honest. Kevin had woven together my grandmother's history, the trust revelation, my family dynamics without making it salacious or cruel. He positioned it as a story about choosing purpose over approval, about redefining success on your own terms. There were quotes from students in the program, from partner organizations, from education policy experts who praised the model. And yes, there were paragraphs about my family, about the Harper name and my father's firm, but they were contextualized properly. This wasn't about them. It was about me. The response was immediate. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from people I hadn't talked to in years. Old college friends, former coworkers, distant relatives. Some were congratulatory. Others were clearly fishing for information. A few were accusatory, suggesting I'd betrayed family privacy by speaking publicly. I ignored most of them, responding only to the handful of people whose support felt genuine. Natalie texted me the day after the article dropped. Just one line. "You could have warned me this was coming." I didn't respond. What would I even say? That I owed her a heads up before telling my own story? That I should have cleared it with the family first, gotten their permission to exist publicly in a way that didn't center them? I was done asking permission. My mother didn't text. She called, repeatedly, until I finally answered on the 4th attempt. I was at the penthouse, cooking dinner, and I almost let it go to voicemail again. But something made me pick up. "Hi, Mom. Did you see what you've done?" She said without preamble, her voice shaking. "That article makes us look like monsters. It makes it sound like we abandoned you." "You did," I said simply. "Not financially, but in every other way that mattered. You decided I wasn't worth your time or attention because I didn't fit your definition of success. The article doesn't lie about that." "We made mistakes," she said, and I could hear her struggling to maintain composure. "But you didn't have to air our family business in a magazine. You didn't have to humiliate us publicly." "I didn't humiliate you," I replied. "I told the truth about my experience. If that's humiliating, maybe you should think about why your behavior looks bad when it's described accurately." There was silence on the line. Then, quieter, she said, "Your father is furious. Board members at the firm have been asking questions. Clients have called. This is affecting our business. That's not my responsibility, I said. You built a reputation on image and connections. I built mine on actual work. If your reputation can't withstand the truth about how you treated your own daughter, that's on you, not me. How can you be so cold? She asked, and for the first time I heard something other than anger in her voice. Hurt, maybe. Confusion. I'm not cold, I said. I'm just not willing to protect you from consequences anymore. I spent years making myself smaller so you wouldn't be uncomfortable. I'm done doing that. She hung up without saying goodbye. I set the phone down and went back to cooking, but my hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear or sadness, but from the weight of finally saying what I'd needed to say for years. The truth wasn't cruel. It was just uncomfortable for people who'd gotten used to me staying quiet. The next morning, I received an email from my father's assistant. Not from him directly, but from Cheryl, who'd worked for him for 15 years. The subject line was meeting request. The email was formal, professionally worded. Mr. Harper would like to schedule a meeting with you at your earliest convenience to discuss recent publicity and its impact on family interests. Please advise your availability. I read it twice, then deleted it. If my father wanted to talk to me, he could call me himself. He could use his actual voice and speak to me like a daughter, not a business problem to be managed through his assistant. He didn't call. 3 days later, I received a letter. Physical mail, thick stationery with the Harper and Associates letterhead. Inside was a typed letter on firm stationery, signed by my father. It was 2 pages, single-spaced, and written in the formal language he used for client correspondence. The opening paragraph expressed disappointment in my decision to speak publicly without consulting the family. The second paragraph outlined concerns about how the article might affect the firm's reputation and client relationships. The third paragraph suggested that we schedule a family meeting to discuss managing the narrative going forward and to establish guidelines for future public statements. The fourth paragraph mentioned the upcoming legacy planning session and suggested it might be appropriate to reconsider my position in the estate distribution given the recent complications. The closing paragraph expressed hope that we could move forward in a way that prioritized family unity and discretion. There was no "Dear Lydia." No love, Dad. No acknowledgement that he was writing to his daughter rather than a PR liability. I read the letter standing in my entryway, still holding my keys, and I felt nothing but clarity. This was who he was. A man who could write 2 pages about reputation management and family unity without once asking how I was, whether I was okay, if there was any way to actually repair what had been broken. I took a photo of the letter and sent it to Brennan Cole with a short message. They're threatening to cut me out of the estate. Not that there's anything to cut me out of anymore, but thought you should know. His response came within minutes. Let them. You don't need anything they have. Document everything anyway. If they continue to escalate, we have options. I folded the letter carefully and filed it away in a drawer with other documents from the estate. Evidence, if I ever needed it, of exactly how my family operated when they felt their control slipping. That afternoon, I had a meeting scheduled at the Lighthouse building with our program director, Angela, and 2 potential board members for the initiative. I drove to Tacoma with the windows down, letting the March wind blow through the car. The meeting was good, productive. We talked about expansion plans, curriculum development, funding sustainability. One of the potential board members was a retired teacher who'd spent 30 years in public schools in South King County. The other was a young tech worker who'd grown up in foster care and taught himself coding at the public library. Both of them understood exactly what we were trying to do and why it mattered. After they left, Angela and I sat in what would soon be the main classroom, surrounded by construction materials and paint samples. She looked at me thoughtfully. Can I say something that might be overstepping? I nodded. Go ahead. That article, she said. I read it. And I just want you to know that whatever complicated family stuff you're dealing with, it doesn't change what you're building here. This place, this work, it's real. It matters. You matter. I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly. Thank you. I mean it, she continued. I've worked in nonprofits for 12 years, and I've seen a lot of founders who are in it for tax breaks or social credit or because it looks good on paper. You're not doing this for any of those reasons. You're doing it because you actually give a damn. That's rare. We sat there for a moment in the quiet of the half-finished space. Through the windows, I could see the water in the distance, gray and constant. This building would open in 2 months. Students would fill these rooms. They'd learn things their schools hadn't taught them, things their families might not know how to teach them. They'd leave with tools and knowledge and maybe, if we did it right, the confidence to build lives on their own terms. This is what mattered. Not my family's approval, not their estate, not their version of success. This tangible, real, messy work of helping people see possibilities they'd been told weren't for them. I drove back to Seattle as the sun started to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. My phone buzzed with a text from Iris. Family group chat is melting down. Your dad sent some long message about loyalty and discretion. Your mom keeps posting articles about family values. Natalie hasn't said anything, but I can feel her stress through the screen. Want me to forward you the thread? No, I wrote back. I'm good. I stopped at a grocery store on the way home and bought ingredients for a real meal, not just the quick dinners I'd been throwing together lately. I took my time cooking, chopping vegetables with care, letting sauce simmer while I opened wine and put on music. When everything was ready, I sat at my dining table with the city lights spread out beyond the windows and ate slowly, tasting everything. My phone buzzed again. Another call from my mother. I silenced it and kept eating. There would be more calls, more letters, more attempts to manage and control and reshape the narrative. They would probably escalate the estate planning, make their rejection official and legal. They might even try to publicly distance themselves from me or discredit my work somehow. And none of it would change the fundamental truth. I didn't need them anymore. Not their money, not their name, not their validation. My grandmother had given me something far more valuable than wealth. She'd given me the freedom to discover who I was without the weight of their expectations crushing me into a shape I was never meant to fit. She'd given me the space to build something meaningful, something mine. And she'd been right. I had waited until I was ready. Not ready to reconcile or forgive, but ready to stop hiding. Ready to stand fully in my own life and let them see exactly what they'd overlooked. The cost was their discomfort, their anger, their sense of betrayal that I'd stopped playing the role they'd written for me. But that was a cost I was finally willing to pay. I finished my dinner, washed the dishes, and settled onto the couch with a book. Outside, the city hummed with its usual evening energy. Inside, I felt quiet. Not empty quiet, but full quiet. The kind that comes when you finally stop waiting for someone else to tell you that you're enough. My phone lit up one more time. A text from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, then curiosity won. The message was short. This is Zoe Parrish. I don't know if you remember me, we were friends in high school. I saw the article. I just wanted to say I'm proud of you. What you're doing matters. And for what it's worth, I always knew you were going to do something important. Your family just couldn't see it. I sat there holding my phone, reading those words over and over. I remembered Zoe. We'd been close once, before my family's expectations had started pulling me in directions that made it hard to maintain friendships outside their approved circle. She'd been the kind of friend who saw you clearly, who didn't need you to be anything other than yourself. I hadn't talked to her in over a decade. I wrote back. I remember you. Thank you for reaching out. This means more than you know. Her response came quickly. Coffee sometime? I'd love to catch up. Hear about the real story, not just the magazine version. Yeah, I wrote. I'd like that. And I meant it. Maybe part of moving forward wasn't just about setting boundaries with people who'd hurt me. Maybe it was also about reopening doors to people who'd seen me when I was still learning to see myself. I set the phone down and returned to my book, but I was smiling now. The path forward wasn't clear or simple. There would be more difficult conversations, more family drama, more moments of doubt and anger and grief for what I'd never had. But there would also be this. New connections, meaningful work, the slow rebuilding of a life that actually fit. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that felt like enough spring arrived in Seattle the way it always did, hesitant and unpredictable, offering days of sunshine followed by weeks of drizzle. The Lighthouse Initiative building was nearly finished, walls painted in warm colors that made the space feel welcoming rather than institutional. I spent most of my days there now, working alongside Angela and the small team we'd assembled. Contractors moved through finishing touches while we organized furniture and set up computer stations. The official opening was scheduled for late April, and somehow that deadline made everything feel more real. Zoe and I had met for coffee 3 times since she'd reached out. She worked as a graphic designer now, ran her own small studio in Ballard, and had a way of asking questions that didn't feel invasive, just genuinely curious. Over our 3rd meeting, she'd offered to help with branding for the Lighthouse Initiative, and I'd accepted without hesitation. It felt good to work with someone who knew my history but didn't define me by it. The legal letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier to my penthouse. I recognized the law firm's name immediately, Whitmore and Associates, the estate planning specialists my parents had used for years. Inside was a formal notification that I was being officially removed from all Harper family trusts, estate plans, and inheritance considerations. The language was cold and precise, citing irreconcilable differences in values and vision. There was a paragraph about how this decision had been reached after careful consideration and consultation with all relevant parties. I read it standing by my kitchen counter, coffee growing cold in my hand. They'd actually done it. Made it official. On paper, I was no longer considered part of the Harper family legacy in any material sense. I waited for the pain to hit, the rejection to land in my chest the way it might have years ago. But instead, I felt something closer to relief. They'd finally made it clear. There was no more ambiguity, no more wondering if maybe someday things would change. This was their answer. This was their choice. I took a photo of the letter and sent it to Brennan with a simple caption. "It's official." He called within 5 minutes. "How are you feeling?" "Honestly?" I said. "Free. They just gave me permission to stop hoping for something that was never going to happen." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a healthy way to look at it. Do you want to respond legally?" "What would be the point?" I asked. "They can't take anything from me that matters. The trust from grandmother is completely separate. They have no claim on my work or my life. Let them have their family legacy. I have my own." "Good," Brennan said. "But I'm documenting this anyway. If they try to come back later, if they try to claim they supported you or had any part in your success, we have a paper trail showing they formally rejected you." "Understood," I said. After we hung up, I filed the letter away with my father's previous correspondence. The drawer was becoming a small archive of rejection, each document another piece of evidence that I'd tried, that I'd shown up, and that they'd chosen not to see me. Not because I wasn't worth seeing, but because they'd decided I didn't fit their narrative. That afternoon, I had lunch with Diane Westbrook at her request. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown, the kind of place where business conversations happened over white tablecloths and wine lists thicker than magazines. She was already seated when I arrived, and she stood to greet me with a warmth that still sometimes caught me off guard. "Lydia," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Thank you for making time." "Of course," I said, settling in. "What's on your mind?" She waited until after we'd ordered, then pulled out a slim folder from her bag. "I wanted to show you something. Your grandmother left instructions that certain documents should be released to you at specific milestones. One of those milestones was if your parents ever formally disinherited you." She slid the folder across the table. "This is a letter she wrote. I was instructed to give it to you if this day ever came." My hand trembled slightly as I opened the folder. Inside was a handwritten letter on my grandmother's stationery, dated 3 months before she died. The handwriting was shaky but still unmistakably hers. I started reading, and Diane quietly sipped her water, giving me space. My dear Lydia, the letter began. If you're reading this, it means I was right about your parents. I hoped I was wrong. I genuinely did. I hoped that Gregory would find his spine and Victoria would find her heart, and that they'd recognize what a gift you are. But if you're holding this letter, it means they chose certainty over courage. They chose the child who confirmed their worldview over the one who challenged them to be better. I want you to know something important. This is not your fault. You could not have been different enough, successful enough, compliant enough to earn their love. That's not how conditional love works. They set terms you could never meet because the terms kept changing. The target kept moving. And eventually, you would have exhausted yourself trying to hit a mark that was never meant for you to reach. I gave you the trust not because I felt sorry for you, but because I saw your potential in ways they couldn't or wouldn't. You have something rare, Lydia. You have the ability to see people who others overlook. You have empathy that doesn't require recognition. You have strength that doesn't need to announce itself. These qualities made you invisible in your family because they value performance over substance. But in the real world, these qualities make you invaluable. The money I left you is substantial, but it's not the real gift. The real gift is freedom. Freedom from needing their approval. Freedom from performing a version of success that doesn't fit who you are. Freedom to build a life that reflects your values, not theirs. Use it wisely. Use it generously. Use it to become the person you already are underneath all the weight of their expectations. And Lydia, if you ever doubt yourself, if you ever wonder if you were wrong to walk away or set boundaries or stop playing their games, remember this. You were never the problem. You were the mirror. And they didn't like what they saw reflected back. I love you. I've always been proud of you. And I'm sorry I won't be there to see the remarkable things you're going to do. But I know you'll do them anyway. You've never needed permission. You just needed to believe that. All my love, Grandma Dorothy. I set the letter down carefully, blinking back tears I hadn't expected. Diane handed me a napkin without comment, her expression understanding. She knew, I said finally. She knew exactly what would happen. She knew you, Diane corrected gently. And she knew them. That combination made the outcome pretty predictable. She paused. How are you doing, really? I'm okay, I said, and it was true. This letter, it's like she's giving me permission to not feel guilty about any of it. You shouldn't feel guilty, Diane said firmly. You set boundaries. You told the truth. You built something meaningful with resources she wanted you to have. There's no guilt in any of that. I know, I said. But knowing it and feeling it are different things. We finished lunch talking about the trust's continued growth, about investment strategies and long-term planning. But my mind kept drifting back to the letter, to my grandmother's words. You were never the problem. You were the mirror. That night, alone in my penthouse, I read the letter again. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in a frame on my desk, where I could see it while I worked. A reminder that someone had seen me clearly and loved what they saw. The weeks leading up to the Lighthouse Initiative opening were intense. Media requests increased after Kevin's article, and I did a handful of interviews, always steering the conversation back to the program and away from family drama. But reporters were curious, and some asked direct questions about the disinheritance. I learned to answer honestly without being cruel. My family and I have different values and visions for how to use resources. We've chosen different paths. I wish them well, but I'm focused on the work that matters to me. Natalie reached out exactly once during this time. It was a text, longer than her usual style. Lydia, I know things are complicated right now. I know you're angry, and maybe you have a right to be. But I want you to know that I never wanted this. I never asked them to choose between us. I don't know how to fix what's broken, but I don't want to lose my sister completely. If you ever want to talk, really talk, I'm here. I read it several times, trying to parse what she was actually saying. Was it guilt? Obligation? Genuine regret? I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I sat with it, turning it over in my mind. Part of me wanted to believe she meant it. Part of me remembered years of her silence when it mattered, her willingness to accept the golden child role without questioning what it cost me. After 3 days, I wrote back. I appreciate you reaching out. I'm not ready to talk yet, but maybe someday. Right now, I need distance from anything related to the family. I hope you understand. Her response came quickly. I understand. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere. It wasn't closure, but it wasn't a door slammed shut either. It was just honesty, which felt like progress. The Lighthouse Initiative opened on a Saturday morning in late April. The weather cooperated, offering one of those perfect spring days where the sky was impossibly blue and the air smelled like possibility. We'd invited students, parents, community partners, and a few carefully selected media outlets. I'd worried the turnout would be small, that maybe the interest hadn't translated into actual attendance. I was wrong. By 10 in the morning, the building was filled with people. Teenagers wandered through the computer lab, trying out the new equipment. Parents asked Angela detailed questions about curriculum and schedule. Local business owners who'd agreed to serve as mentors chatted with board members about partnership opportunities. Zoe had created beautiful promotional materials that lined the walls, explaining our mission and approach in language that was accessible and inspiring. I stood near the entrance, greeting people as they came in, and felt a swell of emotion I hadn't anticipated. This was real. This wasn't just an idea or a tax write-off or a way to process my family issues. This was a physical space filled with people who wanted to learn, who believed education could change their circumstances, who were willing to take a chance on something new. Angela found me around noon, her face flushed with excitement. Lydia, she said, we have a problem. A good problem. We're at capacity for the first session, and we have a waiting list of 43 students. 43? I repeated. She nodded. We're going to need to add another session, maybe 2. We might need to expand the staff sooner than we planned. Figure out what we need, I said. Budget isn't the constraint. If we have students who want to learn, we'll find a way to serve them. She squeezed my arm. You built something special here. You know that, right? I looked around the crowded room, at the students clustered around computers, at the parents reading through program materials, at the volunteers setting up the refreshment table for our afternoon workshop. Yeah, I said softly. I think I'm starting to. The formal program began at 1. Angela welcomed everyone and explained the Lighthouse Initiative's philosophy. Then she introduced me, and I walked to the front of the room with notes I'd prepared but knew I probably wouldn't need. Looking out at the faces watching me, young people who reminded me of myself at their age, searching for someone to believe they were capable of more than their circumstances suggested, I felt the words come easily. I didn't grow up struggling financially, I began, and there was something powerful about starting with that honesty. I grew up with access to resources and opportunities that many people never get. But I did grow up feeling invisible in important ways. I grew up being told, sometimes directly and sometimes through silence, that who I was wasn't valuable unless it looked a certain way or achieved certain markers of success. The room was quiet, attentive. I've learned that there are different kinds of poverty. There's the kind that comes from lack of money, which is real and devastating and limits opportunity in concrete ways. But there's also the kind that comes from lack of belief, from systems and families and communities that tell you that you're not smart enough, not focused enough, not the right kind of person to build wealth or security or a life you're proud of. The Lighthouse Initiative exists because I believe everyone deserves access to financial knowledge and the confidence to use it. Not to become rich, necessarily, but to have choices. To understand how money works so it can be a tool you control instead of a force that controls you. To see pathways forward that maybe nobody in your family has walked before. I paused, looking around the room. My grandmother once told me that the most powerful thing you can do is become impossible to ignore. Not through performance or proving yourself to people who've already decided you're not enough, but through doing work that matters, building things that last, being so fully yourself that apologizing for it never crosses your mind. That's what I want for everyone here. I want you to learn the practical skills, the budgets and investments and all the technical stuff. But I also want you to leave here knowing that you deserve to take up space, to ask questions, to build wealth on your own terms. You don't need anyone's permission to be financially literate or economically powerful. You just need information, support, and the courage to believe you're capable. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, then applause. A girl in the front row, maybe 16, raised her hand. I nodded to her. My mom says money is evil and people who have it are selfish, she said. How do you teach financial literacy without teaching people to be greedy? It's a fair question, I said. Money isn't good or evil. It's neutral. It's a tool, and like any tool, it can be used to build or destroy, to help or harm. Learning how to manage money, how to invest it, how to make it grow, that doesn't make you greedy. It makes you informed. What you choose to do with that information, how you decide to use your resources, that's where values come in. I paused, thinking about my own journey. I have significant financial resources, and I use them to fund this program, to support other organizations doing similar work, to create opportunities for people who've been told they don't deserve them. That's not greed. That's choice. If I didn't understand money, if I was afraid of it or ashamed of having it, I couldn't do any of that. The girl nodded slowly, considering. So it's about what you do with it? Exactly, I said. It's always about what you do with it. The afternoon session was hands-on, small groups working through basic budgeting scenarios with volunteer mentors. I circulated through the room, listening to conversations, watching students lean into the work with focus and curiosity. At one table, a boy was asking detailed questions about compound interest. At another, a girl was creating a savings plan for college expenses. They were engaged, thoughtful, taking it seriously. By the time the day ended, I was exhausted in the best way. Angela and I locked up the building together, standing outside in the early evening light. We did it, she said. First day, and we actually did it. We did, I agreed. And tomorrow we do it again. She laughed. Yeah. Tomorrow we do it again. I drove back to Seattle with the windows down, letting the cool air wake me up. My phone had been on silent all day, and when I checked it at a stoplight, I saw 3 missed calls from my mother and 2 from Natalie. There were also several congratulatory texts from Iris, from Zoe, from colleagues and supporters who'd seen social media posts about the opening. I responded to the supportive messages and ignored the calls from my family. At home, I poured a glass of wine and stood at the windows overlooking the city. The lights were just starting to come on, the skyline transitioning from day to night. I thought about the girl who'd asked about greed, about whether wanting financial security made you selfish. I thought about the boy calculating compound interest and the parents who'd thanked me for creating this space. My phone buzzed again. Another call from my mother. This time, I answered. Hello? Lydia, she said, and her voice had an edge I couldn't quite read. We saw the coverage of your program opening. It was all over social media. I know, I said. It went really well. She was quiet for a moment. Your father and I would like to meet with you. To discuss things. To try to find some common ground. I set down my wine glass. What things? What common ground? She paused, searching for words. Your work. Your public profile. The way our family is being portrayed. We think there might be a way to move forward that benefits everyone. Let me guess, I said. You want me to soften how I talk about the family. Maybe include you in some of the Lighthouse Initiative publicity. Let people think you supported this all along. Silence on the line. Then, carefully, we've made mistakes. We acknowledge that. But continuing to air family issues publicly doesn't help anyone. It makes us all look bad. It makes you look bitter. I took a slow breath. I'm not bitter. I'm honest. There's a difference. We can discuss this in person, she pressed. Next week, perhaps. Lunch somewhere quiet. I appreciate the offer, I said. But I'm not interested in managing optics or negotiating how I tell my story. I've moved on. I'm building something meaningful. Whether that looks good or bad for the Harper family reputation isn't my concern anymore. Lydia, please, she said, and for a moment she sounded almost vulnerable. We're still your parents. Are you? I asked quietly. Because parents usually know basic facts about their child's life. They usually ask how you're doing before they ask how you're affecting their reputation. They usually love you before they calculate whether you're useful to them. That's not fair, she said, her voice hardening again. Maybe not, I replied. But it's true. When you're ready to actually know me, not manage me or reshape me into something more convenient, let me know. Until then, I think distance is healthier for everyone. I hung up before she could respond. My hand was shaking slightly. The conversation had been harder than I'd expected, not because I doubted my position but because some part of me still hoped she'd surprise me. Still hoped she'd say the right thing, ask the right question, show up in the way I'd always needed. But she hadn't. And maybe she never would. I finished my wine and went to bed early, emotionally drained but also strangely settled. The Lighthouse Initiative was real. My life was real. The love and support I'd found from people who actually saw me was real. Everything else was just noise, and I was finally learning to turn down the volume. Summer arrived with the kind of heat that made Seattle forget it was supposed to be temperate. The Lighthouse Initiative had been running for 3 months, and we'd already expanded to accommodate the demand. What started as one evening session had grown into 4 weekly sessions across different age groups. Angela hired 2 additional instructors, both former teachers who brought decades of experience working with underserved communities. The waiting list kept growing. I still worked occasional shifts at the Copper Bean, not because I needed to but because I genuinely enjoyed the rhythm of it. My coworkers knew about the Lighthouse Initiative now. One of them had seen the article, and word had spread. They treated me mostly the same, though sometimes I'd catch curious glances or overhear whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by. The manager, a woman named Teresa who'd always been kind to me, pulled me aside one morning during a quiet moment. You know you don't have to keep working here, she said gently. I mean, obviously you're welcome to stay as long as you want. But if you're doing it out of some sense of obligation or because you think we need you, we'll be okay. I smiled at her directness. I'm not staying out of obligation. I actually like being here. It keeps me grounded. Reminds me that work doesn't always have to be complicated or high stakes to be valuable. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Okay. But the second it stops feeling good, you tell me. Deal? Deal. That afternoon, Iris called with news. Your parents are hosting a charity gala in August, she said. It's for the hospital foundation. Big event, lots of donors, the usual Harper production. And apparently they're planning to announce a major gift in your grandmother's name. I sat down slowly. In her name? How much? 2 million, Iris said. To establish the Dorothy Fontaine Memorial Scholarship Fund for underprivileged students. They're going to present it as continuing her legacy of giving back. The audacity of it hit me like cold water. They'd rejected her actual legacy, the trust she'd carefully constructed for me, and now they were using her name to rebuild their own reputation. They were taking credit for generosity they'd never shown, wrapping themselves in my grandmother's memory to look philanthropic. Are they inviting me? I asked, though I already knew the answer. No, Iris said. At least, not that I've heard. I think they're hoping you just stay quiet. Let them have their moment. Of course they are. I leaned back in my chair, thinking. Do you want me to find out more? Iris asked. See what the actual plan is? No, I said. But thank you for telling me. I sat with that information for 2 days, feeling anger simmer underneath my daily routines. They'd disinherited me, cut me out completely, and now they were using my grandmother's name to make themselves look generous. It wasn't illegal. It was just deeply, profoundly wrong. On the third day, I called Brennan. "Tell me about donor-advised funds," I said. "I want to make a gift to the hospital foundation. In my grandmother's actual honor, not as some PR move." "How much are we talking?" he asked. $5 million, I said. "Twice what they're giving. I want it structured so that it's completely separate from anything bearing the Harper name. I want the hospital to know that this gift comes from Dorothy Fontaine's actual legacy, the one she chose, not the one they're trying to rewrite." Brennan was quiet for a moment. "You understand this will make waves." "That's the point," I said. "They don't get to erase her real intentions and replace them with a sanitized version that serves their image. She wanted her money to create opportunities for people who'd been overlooked. That's exactly what this does." He chuckled softly. "All right. Let's make it happen." The paperwork took 3 weeks to finalize. The hospital foundation was thrilled, slightly confused, and very careful about how they approached the situation. They had existing relationships with my parents, after all, and suddenly having two separate Fontaine-related gifts appearing simultaneously was diplomatically tricky. I made it easier by being completely transparent. "This gift honors my grandmother's actual wishes as expressed in her estate planning," I told the foundation director. "It's separate from my family's contribution and should be recognized as such." The director, a pragmatic woman named Caroline Winters, looked at me across her desk. "I appreciate your clarity. And I'll be honest, this is an incredibly generous gift. But I need to ask, are you prepared for the reaction this might cause?" "I've been prepared my whole life," I said. "This is just the first time I'm choosing the reaction instead of having it chosen for me." The announcement was scheduled for late July, 2 weeks before my parents' gala. The hospital put out a press release that was carefully worded but clear. The Dorothy Fontaine Legacy Fund, established through the generosity of her granddaughter Lydia Harper, will provide full scholarships to medical students from underrepresented backgrounds, with preference given to first-generation college students and those from foster care systems. The response was immediate. Media outlets picked it up because the amount was significant and because my name was already attached to education philanthropy through the Lighthouse Initiative. A few journalists made the connection to my family and started asking questions about the timing, about whether this was related to the Harper family's planned donation. I gave one carefully worded statement. My grandmother believed in creating pathways for people who'd been told they didn't belong. This fund honors her true legacy and will help future healthcare providers who might otherwise never get the chance. My mother called within hours of the announcement. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. And again. On the 4th attempt, I answered. "What were you thinking?" she said, not bothering with a greeting. "You've completely undermined what we were trying to do." "I wasn't trying to undermine anything," I said calmly. "I was honoring grandmother's actual wishes. The ones she put in writing when she created the trust. The ones you've spent years trying to ignore." "This makes us look like we're competing with our own daughter," she said. "It makes us look ridiculous." "Then maybe you shouldn't have tried to claim her legacy as your own," I replied. "She left that money to me specifically because she knew you'd do exactly this. Use her name for appearances while ignoring what she actually stood for." "That's not true," my mother said, but her voice lacked conviction. "We loved her. We're honoring her memory. By making a donation that's half the size of what she left me monthly?" I asked. "By attaching your names to her generosity while actively rejecting the granddaughter she chose to support? That's not honor. That's appropriation." The line went quiet. Then, icily, "Your father wants to speak with you." "Fine," I said. "Put him on." There was a pause, some muffled conversation, then my father's voice. "Lydia, this has gone far enough. You're making our family look divided and dysfunctional." "We are divided and dysfunctional," I said. "I'm just the first one willing to say it out loud. We've tried to be patient with you," he continued as if I hadn't spoken. We've given you space to work through whatever issues you have. But this public warfare needs to stop. You're damaging the family reputation. Dad, I said, and my voice was steady despite the emotion underneath. You formally disinherited me. You sent me a legal letter removing me from the family estate. You don't get to claim I'm the one creating division. That was a business decision, he said. A necessary boundary after you spoke to the press about private family matters. It was a choice, I corrected. A choice that made your values very clear. And now I'm making my own choices about how to honor the one family member who actually valued me. If that damages your reputation, maybe your reputation was built on a foundation that deserved to crack. He hung up without another word. I set down my phone and realized I was smiling. Not from cruelty or satisfaction in their discomfort, but from the sheer relief of finally, completely, telling them the truth without softening it or managing their feelings or trying to preserve a relationship that had never really existed. The next few weeks were strange. The hospital foundation's announcement generated more media attention than I'd anticipated. Several outlets ran stories comparing the two Fontaine-related donations, and while they were careful to stay neutral, the implication was clear. The granddaughter's gift was larger, more specific in its mission, and came with no strings attached beyond honoring Dorothy Fontaine's actual values. My parents' gala proceeded as planned, but I heard through Iris that the attendance was lower than expected and the event had a subdued energy. They presented their scholarship fund, made their speeches about family legacy and continuing traditions of giving. But everyone in the room knew about my donation. Everyone knew there was another story being told, one that didn't center them as the heroes. Natalie texted me the night of the gala. I'm here. It's awkward. They keep getting questions about you. About why you're not here. About the hospital fund. Mom looks like she's going to break. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I'm sorry you're in the middle of this. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I'm just tired of being erased. Her reply came quickly. I know. I think I'm starting to understand what you've been saying. About how they treat you. I'm seeing it differently now. That message sat between us, heavy with implication. What changed? I asked. They keep talking about family unity and loyalty, she wrote. But it's always on their terms. You're supposed to be loyal by staying quiet. By not challenging the narrative. I'm supposed to be loyal by being successful in the exact way they define it. It's exhausting. I closed my eyes, feeling something shift. For years, I'd seen Natalie as complicit, as someone who benefited from my erasure and never questioned it. But maybe she'd been trapped too, just in a different kind of cage. One lined with praise instead of silence, but a cage nonetheless. Thank you for saying that, I wrote back. It means more than you know. The conversation didn't fix everything. We didn't suddenly become close or resolve years of complicated dynamics. But it opened a door that had been closed, and that felt like progress. August melted into September, and the Lighthouse Initiative continued to grow. We'd served over 300 students in our first 6 months. The curriculum was being adapted by 2 other cities, and we'd received inquiries from 4 more. Angela and I spent long afternoons planning expansion strategies, talking about how to scale without losing the personal touch that made the program work. One evening, I was at the Lighthouse building late, reviewing financial reports in what had become my makeshift office. My actual office was still mostly empty, just a desk and a chair and walls I hadn't bothered to decorate. I heard footsteps in the hallway and looked up to see a girl I recognized from one of our sessions. Her name was Maya, 16, sharp-eyed and skeptical in the way teenagers are when they've learned not to trust easy promises. Hi, I said, setting down my pen. Did you forget something? She shook her head, hovering in the doorway. I wanted to ask you something. But it might be rude. Ask anyway, I said. I don't mind rude if it's honest. She came in and sat down across from me, studying my face as if trying to solve a puzzle. Why do you do this? She asked. Like, really? Why do you care if kids like me learn about money? Because someone should have cared when I needed to learn things too, I said. Different things, maybe, but still. Someone should have taught me that my worth wasn't dependent on other people's approval. That I could build something meaningful on my own terms. I wish I'd learned that earlier. She considered this. But you're rich. You didn't need to learn that. Money doesn't protect you from being made to feel worthless, I said. It doesn't shield you from family that sees you as a disappointment or a problem. I had resources, but I didn't have support in the ways that mattered. And once I understood that, once I figured out how to build a life that actually fit me, I wanted to help other people do the same thing. Even if their starting point is completely different from mine. Maya nodded slowly. My mom thinks you're doing this for tax write-offs. That rich people only help because it makes them look good. Some people do, I said honestly. But I do it because I remember what it feels like to be told you don't matter. To be invisible in spaces where you should be seen. I don't want anyone else to feel that way, especially not about something as practical as understanding money. She stood up, and for a moment I thought she was leaving. Then she said, quietly, thank you. For not making it feel like charity. For treating us like we're smart enough to learn this stuff. You are smart enough, I said. That was never the question. The question was always whether anyone would bother to teach you. After she left, I sat in the quiet office and felt the weight of why this mattered. Not to prove something to my family or to justify my grandmother's faith in me, though those things had mattered at the beginning. But because Maya and hundreds of kids like her deserved to understand that their circumstances didn't define their potential. That knowledge was power, and power didn't have to be hoarded by people who already had it. October brought rain and falling leaves and an unexpected email from my father. Not through his assistant, not formal business correspondence, just a direct message from his personal account. The subject line was simply, "Can we talk?" The email was brief. Lydia, I know things between us have been difficult. I know I've made mistakes as a father. Your mother and I would like to meet with you, not to argue or negotiate, but to listen. If you're willing. No agenda beyond that. Please consider it. Dad. I read it 3 times, looking for the angle, the hidden conditions, the real reason behind the request. But the words were simple, almost vulnerable in their directness. I showed it to Diane during our quarterly review meeting the next day. What do you think? I asked. She read it carefully, then looked at me. What do you want to do? I don't know, I admitted. Part of me thinks it's pointless. That nothing will really change. But another part of me wonders if I'll regret not trying one more time. Only you can answer that, Diane said. But I'll tell you what your grandmother told me once. She said that closure doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like giving people one last chance to show you who they are, and then believing them. I thought about that for days. Finally, I wrote back. I'm willing to meet. But I need you to understand that I'm not coming back into the fold. I'm not softening my story or pretending the past didn't happen. If you want to listen, genuinely listen, I'll talk. But I'm done performing for you. His response was quick. Understood. Thank you for being willing. We met at a neutral location, a quiet restaurant neither of us had history with. I arrived first, deliberately, and chose a table where I could see the door. When my parents walked in, I was struck by how much older they looked. My mother's hair had more gray than I remembered. My father moved more slowly, carefully. They saw me and walked over, and for a moment we all just stood there, uncertain. Thank you for coming, my mother said finally. We sat down, ordered coffee none of us really wanted, and then silence stretched between us. My father cleared his throat. We read the statement you gave to the reporter. About the hospital fund honoring your grandmother's true legacy. That was hard to hear, but it was fair. My mother's hands were folded tightly on the table. We've spent a lot of time in the past few months thinking about how we treated you. How we've made you feel invisible. And we're starting to understand that you were right. We did erase you. I waited, not rushing to fill the silence or make it easier for them. Your grandmother left you that trust because she saw something in you that we failed to see, my father continued. And instead of asking ourselves why, instead of trying to understand what we'd missed, we just got angry. We felt betrayed that she didn't trust us with you. But she was right not to. I felt my chest tighten. What changed? I asked. Why now? My mother looked at me directly for what felt like the first time in years. The gala was difficult. Watching people ask about you, about why you weren't there, seeing their reactions when they learned about your donation. It made us face something we'd been avoiding. You've built something remarkable without us. You've become someone impressive without our approval or guidance. And that should make us proud, but instead we made it about our embarrassment. I took a slow breath. So this is about your reputation. About how it looks that your daughter succeeded without you. No, my father said firmly. Or, not just that. He glanced at my mother, who nodded slightly. We saw a video. From one of your lighthouse sessions. A student posted it online. You were talking about feeling invisible, about how people overlook you when you don't fit their definition of success. And, he paused, his voice thick, I recognized myself in that description. I recognized us. My mother's eyes were wet. Lydia, I don't know if we can fix this. I don't know if you can forgive us or if we even deserve forgiveness. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for making you feel like you weren't enough. I'm sorry for choosing image over relationship. I'm sorry for being so afraid of what other people thought that I couldn't see my own daughter. The words landed differently than I'd expected. Not fixing everything, not erasing years of pain, but landing nonetheless. I'm glad you're seeing it now, I said carefully. But I need you to understand something. I don't need you anymore. Not financially, not for validation, not for a sense of belonging. I've built those things myself. I know, my father said. And that's what we're coming to terms with. You don't need us, but we're hoping you might still want us in your life in some capacity. Even if it's small. Even if it takes years. I looked at them, these people who'd raised me and rejected me and were now sitting across from me with something that looked like genuine remorse. I thought about Maya asking why I cared. I thought about my grandmother's letter telling me I was the mirror. I thought about the life I'd built, solid and real and entirely mine. I can't promise you anything, I said. I can't promise I'll ever fully trust you or that we'll have the kind of relationship you might want. But I'm willing to keep talking. To see if there's a version of connection that works for all of us without requiring me to be smaller or different or more convenient. That's all I can offer right now. My mother nodded, wiping her eyes. That's more than we deserve. We talked for another hour. Not about money or legacy or public image, but about smaller things. They asked about the Lighthouse Initiative, really asked, and I told them about the students and the curriculum and the expansion plans. I asked about the consulting firm, and my father talked about some of the challenges they were facing, the industry changes he was trying to navigate. It wasn't easy. There were awkward pauses and moments where old patterns tried to reassert themselves. But it was different. More honest. As we were leaving, my mother touched my arm gently. Could I see the lighthouse building sometime? I'd like to understand what you've created there. I looked at her, searching for the angle, but her face was open, genuinely curious. Yeah, I said. I think I'd like that. The drive back to Seattle felt strange. I wasn't fixed or healed or suddenly at peace with everything. But something had shifted. They'd acknowledged the harm. They'd seen themselves clearly, even if it took years and public embarrassment to get there. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Over the following months, my parents and I developed a tentative new relationship. My mother visited the Lighthouse Initiative and spent an afternoon talking to students and reviewing curriculum. She was genuinely impressed, and for once, she said so without qualifications or comparisons to Natalie. My father made a donation to the program, not huge, not trying to overshadow anything, just supporting the work. We had dinner every few weeks, slow careful conversations where we learned to see each other as adults rather than playing out old dynamics. Natalie joined sometimes, and gradually the four of us found a rhythm that didn't require anyone to be invisible or perfect or anything other than themselves. It wasn't the family I'd wanted as a child. It wasn't unconditional love or deep emotional intimacy. But it was honest, and that turned out to be enough. The Lighthouse Initiative expanded to 3 additional cities over the next year. We developed partnerships with schools and community organizations, trained facilitators, created an open-source curriculum that anyone could adapt. The hospital fund started distributing scholarships, and I got letters from recipients telling me how the support changed their lives. My grandmother's legacy was living on, not in plaques or formal ceremonies, but in opportunities given to people who'd been told they didn't belong. I eventually quit my job at the Copper Bean, not because I had to but because my time was increasingly needed elsewhere. Teresa threw me a small party on my last shift, and I realized that those hours steaming milk and making small talk had given me something I'd needed. A place where I was just Lydia, where my value wasn't tied to money or accomplishments or family names. Just to showing up, doing the work, being present. One evening in late spring, almost 2 years after that first dinner with my parents, I stood in my penthouse looking out at the city. My phone buzzed with a message from Natalie. "Dinner at my place next week? I'm cooking. Bringing someone I want you to meet." I smiled and wrote back confirmation. The sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, and I thought about my grandmother's letter. "You were never the problem. You were the mirror." She'd been right. I'd reflected back to my family the things they didn't want to see about themselves. Their conditional love, their obsession with image, their willingness to erase anything that complicated their narrative. And when I stopped apologizing for that reflection, when I stopped trying to change it to make them comfortable, everything shifted. They had to decide whether to look away or finally see clearly. Some of them chose to keep looking. Others didn't. And I'd learned to be okay with both outcomes. My life wasn't perfect. I still had hard days and complicated feelings about my family. The trust fund still felt surreal sometimes, an amount of money that didn't match any internal sense of deserving or earning. But I'd learned to hold it lightly, to see it as my grandmother intended, not as a measure of my worth but as a tool to create worth in the world. The Lighthouse Initiative was thriving. The hospital fund was changing lives. I had relationships built on honesty rather than performance. And most importantly, I had a sense of self that didn't require anyone else's validation. I knew who I was, what I valued, what mattered. I'd let my parents think I was struggling while the trust generated wealth I never touched. And in doing so, I'd learned the truth about who they were and who I needed to become. Not bitter or vengeful, but clear-eyed and free. Free to build something meaningful. Free to help others build their own paths. Free to finally be seen, not by people who'd never really looked, but by the ones who mattered. Including myself. The city lights flickered on below as darkness settled in. I turned away from the window and picked up my laptop. There were grant applications to review, emails from students to answer, plans to make for the next Lighthouse Initiative session. Work that mattered. Work that was mine. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. It was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.